distinguished guests, may I welcome you to the Free Market Roadshow on behalf of the Danube Institute here in Budapest, which I have the good fortune to be president, and on behalf also of our partner institution, the Austrian Economic Centre. As its name suggests, the Free Market Roadshow is an unusual, even unique institution which tours the whole of Europe and the Caucasus, presenting, analysing and debating the economic, social and political problems facing our societies from the standpoint of freedom, the celebration, I should say, and the defence of freedom, free minds and free markets in Milton Friedman's formulation. Founded in 2008 by the Austrian Economic Centre and its director, Dr. Barbara Kolm, who is also the deputy president of Austria's National Bank, the Roadshow is rooted in cooperation between over 100 universities, think tanks, and other cooperating institutions across Europe and America. The Danube Institute was itself founded in 2013 and became a member of the Roadshow community in 2015. We have been partners ever since. I admire Dr. Kolm's foresight in establishing the Roadshow in 2008. The world was then enjoying an unusual period of economic progress and international stability under a regime of political democracy and liberal rules on trade and capital movements that had started 2 decades before, following the collapse of communism. Doubtless there were errors and failures of policy in those decades, as there always are. And because economic progress devalues some skills and the industries based upon them, as it rewards new technical innovations and the industries built upon them, there are always victims of progress as well as beneficiaries. But we should never forget that those years of market freedom saw the biggest sustained increase in world living standards in history, lifting several billion people, especially in Asia, out of grinding poverty into middle-class living standards. The newly industrialized economies in which they worked produced goods and services at lower prices, and that, in turn, increased the prosperity of working and middle-class people in Europe and North America in the form of cheaper imports and lower inflation of everyday goods. All countries in those years enjoyed, I'm sure there were 1 or 2 exceptions, but all countries enjoyed a long economic boom, started slowly, of course, in this region, based on a regime of market cooperation. And although there were wars and rumors of wars to disrupt it, famously Iraq, those years also saw an unusual degree of security cooperation between the major powers, the US, Western Europe, Russia, and China. It also saw the development of a regime of laws and rules in trade, diplomacy, and military affairs to solve economic disputes and to strengthen international security. That history is being rewritten today. We have forgotten, for instance, our fears in the 1990s that Central Europe would see the revival of the evils of the 1930s, of anti-Semitism, irredentism, and political extremism. And we have also forgotten our relief when instead the expansion of NATO and the EU created a zone of prosperity, security, and market democracies, where in 1989 there had been economic wastelands and industrial slums. That was a remarkable achievement of new and old Western statesmanship on both sides of the old Iron Curtain. We shouldn't let ourselves be persuaded by our enemies that it never happened. As Dr. Kolm foresaw, however, and as Ronald Reagan once remarked, freedom is never more than 1 generation away from extinction. He said, we didn't pass it on to our children in our bloodstream. It must be fought for and defended by each generation. And interestingly, that same year, the same year that the Free Market Roadshow was established, also witnessed 2 other events: the 2008 financial crash and Vladimir Putin's seizure of 2 provinces in the Russo-Georgian War. Those events showed that things were changing. What some of us called the holiday from history that started in 1989 was beginning to come to an end. Indeed, those two events helped to cause its end. The 2008 financial crash was misinterpreted as a purely market failure, when in fact it was at least as much, I would argue more so, a government failure, and in particular, a failure of perverse regulation. The effect of it, however, was to weaken the confidence of governments, political leaders, and even conservative elites in market freedoms. Some leaders, like Nicolas Sarkozy, were, of course, only too happy to proclaim that the state is back and to abandon market freedom policies. Simultaneously, the failure of NATO and the EU to respond effectively to Russia's occupation of Georgia, and even more so, to give no effective reassurance to the 23 Central European political and intellectual leaders who sought in 2009 President Obama's restatement of American commitment to the region. Those things both encourage President Putin to proceed further and weakened the West's resolve further. Though the state was back, its policies very often made many situations worse, since government differs from the market in having no automatic course corrector when its policies begin to fail. We were moving in those years into a time of troubles. I should just say that the two events actually occurred in 2008, occurred in the same year as the foundation of the Free Market Roadshow, but they occurred after the foundation. So this is really an act of prescience on Barbara Colm's part, and I'm sorry she's not here to hear me say this. But we were moving into a time of troubles. Let me briefly list some. The world recession that followed the crash, Russia's annexation of the Crimea, and Putin's support for breakaway separatists in the two provinces of eastern Ukraine. Successive crises, financial and economic, over the euro, and the decade-long recession that it inflicted on Mediterranean Europe, above all on Greece. The migration crisis of 2015, arising partly out of a failure to have policies in Europe that didn't allow anybody who could get into one country to travel everywhere. And not all the people who got in were friends. But above all, the COVID-19 crisis that both revealed increasingly authoritarian attitudes on the part of public opinion in Western democracies, and that encouraged governments to lock down their population to combat the illness in ways that, in retrospect, look mistaken and counterproductive, and that are certainly proving expensive in retrospect, without, in my view, being necessary. In fact, we have seen that when governments are released from financial and economic constitutional constraints, they can act in astoundingly feckless ways. As a result, today, we are facing an embarrassment of crises in economics, in finance, in energy, in foreign policy, and of course, in war. Europe is in a war, or at least Moscow says it is, with Russia, on whom it depends for something like half its energy. At the same time, we are pursuing energy policies of switching from fossil fuels in order to reach net zero emissions by the end of the century, at midpoint by 2050. Targets which look, frankly, impossible to reach. The attempt by governments to stimulate their economies post-COVID have stimulated a sharp rise and inflation and a cost of living crisis instead. Theories of modern monetary policies have encouraged the build-up of massive indebtedness, which, as it becomes due, will cause other crises to break out in every country. And finally, even in meetings like this, we don't always understand how we blundered into this swamp. Some people are inclined to blame these crises on populism. But almost all these policies were carried out in the policies of mainstream centre-right and centre-left parties. Those policies include government largesse, the funding of unrealistically extravagant expansions of existing safety nets, and a feckless attitude, as I just outlined, to both energy policy and resistance to Russia's expansionism that have now merged in a very dangerous way. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an extraordinarily distinguished roster of experts to discuss how these crises interact for the rest of today. And I'm afraid we will need them. With that, I'm glad to open the conference, and I invite my colleague, Anton Benderovich, to open the first session.